If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I want to give a quick content warning. In this episode, there is some violence. I will leave timestamps in the episode description for this episode in case you want or need to skip over the violent part. Alright, now let's get started on this episode. Covered a lot of pirates on this podcast this season. It's actually hard to believe that this season is almost over. If we think back to those pirates and how they got into piracy, we will find, of course, that there were different reasons why they got into piracy. But for some, it seemed that even if it was a secondary reason, they became pirates because they wanted the fame and the glory. But the pirate that I have to tell you about today most certainly did not get into piracy because he wanted to be written down in history as a famous pirate. In fact, he actually made the effort to make sure that the fact that he was a pirate remain a secret. Ahoy! My name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 13th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. 'Tis season 3 o' History Shelf, and I have titled this season, Yo-Ho, Yo-Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. In this season be all about pirates, the pirates and scallywags that sailed the 7 seas and some rivers, looking for booty as they made their travels. Some of these pirates came from humble beginnings, while others surprisingly came from well-to-do families. But no matter where or who they came from, they all had one thing in common. They would be pirates. And for this week, I am talking about James Ford. Today, we are going to take a break from sailing the 7 seas, and we are going to take a trip on a river. That's right, today I am going to be covering a river pirate. James is actually the only river pirate this season. Next week, it will be back to the open ocean. But for now, we are going to stay in fresh waters. Today is probably going to be the shortest episode of this season. There's just not a whole lot of information that we have on James, but I do think that this is a really interesting story. James N. Ford Sr. was born on October 22, 1775 in present-day Spartanburg, South Carolina. So he has a birthday coming up if you are listening to this whenever it comes out. There is a possibility that the N in his name stood for Neil. James was a lot of things in his life. He was a state militia officer, a planter, a businessman, a justice of the peace, a sheriff, a judge, a ferry operator, a tavern owner, a slave trader, a slave stealer, a gang leader, and a river pirate. James was born to Philip and Elizabeth Ford. Philip and Elizabeth had 2 other children, sons Philip Jr. and Richard. When James was young, James's father passed away. James's mother went on to marry a man named William Prince. William brought his own children to the marriage, and Elizabeth and William also gave James half-siblings. His siblings actually played an important part in James's life. They would provide James with connections that helped advance both his legitimate endeavors and his criminal activities. William relocated James's family to Princeton, Kentucky. James was married twice in his life. His first wife was Susan Miles. He married her in the late 1790s. Susan was the niece of the ferry keeper at Miles Ferry between Kentucky and Illinois below Cave-In Rock. More on Cave-In Rock a little later on. Together, James and Susan had a son named Philip, born on November 25th, 1800. A son named William M., born in 1804, and a daughter named Cassandra, born in either 1805 or 1806. James outlived both of his sons from his first marriage. Philip died on November 23rd, 1831, and William died on November 2nd, 1832. In the 1820s, Susan passed away. In 1829, James married his second and last wife, Elizabeth W. Armstead Fraser. Elizabeth was a widow whose husband died suddenly while he was staying on James's plantation in what was then Livingston County, Kentucky, but is now Crittenden County, Kentucky. Together, James and Elizabeth had one son named James N. Ford Jr. around 1830. We don't have a portrait of James, but there is a record of James's physical appearance. This description was given by Dr. Charles H. Webb. Charles was the husband of James's daughter. Charles said, quote, "He was about 6 feet in height and of powerful build, a perfect Hercules in point of strength. But he has now grown too corpulent to undergo much fatigue. His head is large and well-shaped. His sandy brown hair, now thin, is turning gray, for he must be fully 50 years old. His eyes, of a steel gray color, are brilliant, and his glance quick and penetrating. His nose rather short and thick, his upper lip remarkably long, his mouth large, and his lips full and sensuous. He has a broad, firm double chin, and his voice is deep and sonorous. His complexion is very florid. He gives one of the idea of a good-natured rather than a surly bulldog, but if aroused, I should say, he would be a lion tamer." End quote. Between July 1st, 1799 and December 15th, 1802, James was captain of the Livingston County Cavalry Company in the 24th Kentucky Militia Regiment. In 1810, he became captain of the Grand Pierre Area Militia Company of the 4th Regiment of Illinois Territory Militia. From July 15th, 1811 to August 8th, 1811, James was also the captain of the Illinois Territory Militia. James would be promoted to major on November 28th, 1811. James never saw combat, but his military service still came with local prestige, and his prestige and connections were what really helped him to be successful in his criminal life. James made money through crimes, which I will get to in a little bit, but he also made money through legal means. He got the rights to Miles Ferry. It had been owned by his first wife's family. Miles Ferry would become Ford's Ferry. He also operated Ferry Ohio upriver from Cave-In Rock, and through his second wife he got Fraser Salt Works. Now that I've covered his legitimate businesses, now let's move on to his life as a criminal. The Sturtevant Gang was a family gang of counterfeiters, and James had an association with them. James owned the fort that the gang occupied. James was the leader of the gang Ford's Ferry Gang. Ford's Ferry Gang terrorized flatboats and James's own river ferry that rolled down the Ohio River. They attacked them for tradable goods from local farms. Francis Prince and Nathaniel Simpson were possible members of James's gang, and Henry C. Strauss and James's sons Philip and William were confirmed members. Some of his known associates were, of course, the Sturtevant Gang, John Harmon, Isaiah L. Potts, aka Billy Potts Sr., and Alonzo Pennington and the Pennington Gang. James and the rest of his gang used Cave-in Rock as their base of operations. Cave-in Rock is located on the Illinois side of the lower Ohio River. Other names that the cave has been called is Rockin' Cave, Rocking Cave, Rock and Cave, House of Nature, The Cave, Big Cave, Potato Cave, and Murals Cave. The cave became famous because it was a popular hideout for all sorts of outlaws. For a time, it was believed that James was operating a tavern and brothel out of the cave in the spring of 1799 under the name James Wilson. But now that is believed to not be true because there has been a James Wilson that has been discovered that lived in that time and place. While he was being the leader of a gang, to the public, he was a pillar of the community. To the public, he kept a squeaky clean image. He would have been the last person someone would have suspected to be a river pirate, which is what I find so interesting about this story. If you think back to the other pirates that I have talked about this season, think about how they themselves helped spread the word of their evil deeds across oceans. Think back to Blackbeard. He actually helped spread lies to make himself seem worse than he really was. But James operated in secrecy. Because of his successful businesses and nefarious activities, James was able to acquire some wealth. He owned a 500-acre plantation in Toulouse, Kentucky, and he also owned quite a few other properties in Kentucky and Illinois. James was also a slave owner, and while he didn't want the public to see his sinister side, he had no problem with showing it to his slaves. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. James was an asshole. He was a racist asshole. James was a very cruel slave owner. James allegedly used a vice to secure the head of a slave, and then he cut off his ears and pulled out his teeth. He also allegedly bound a slave's hand to their foot and dragged him behind a mule through a field of tree stumps. The slave died. In 1832, James had a runaway slave notice printed in the Sangamo Journal newspaper for a slave named Ben. In the notice, it said that Ben had had his ears removed for robbing a boat on the Ohio River. I guess James was the only one that was allowed to rob boats on the Ohio River. Another one of James's alleged criminal associates was John Hart Crenshaw. John was known for kidnapping free African Americans and selling them into the illegal slave trade. He was also known for practicing illegal slave breeding. On July 7th, 1833, James was ambushed and shot to death near his home by members of his own gang. And that was the end of James Ford, or as some writers have called him, Satan's Ferryman. We are not sure why that his own gang members turned against him. He is buried in Ford Family Cemetery in Kirksville, Kentucky. After he died and all of James's distant relatives were killed, the Pennington Gang took over Ford's Ferry Gang. Ford's Ferry continued on thriving after James's death. The small town built around Ford's Ferry came to be called Ford's Ferry. According to the 19th century Collins Historical Sketches of Kentucky, Ford's Ferry had 4 stores, 2 hotels, and a population of 75. But the success didn't last forever, and the ferry and the town have since been abandoned. And that was the life of James Ford. Thank you so much for listening to the 13th episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Zheng Yishao. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the Snapchat is History_Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in the poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Or you can click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help out this podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to keep listening to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.